So first of all, good evening, everyone. My name is Ana Lucia. For those of you who don't know me, I am one of the co-presidents at GRLA. I wanted to thank you for being here and for choosing to have joined the book club this year. I want to welcome each of you to our first book club discussion event this fall. We are very delighted to welcome Pauline Brown, the former chairman of LVMH North America, to discuss our first reading of the GRLA book club. This one is titled Aesthetic Intelligence, How to Boost It and Use It in Business and Beyond. And of course, thank you, Ms. Brown, for being here today. We really appreciate it and we look forward to this insightful book discussion.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the generous introduction.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alex, and I'm the other co-president of GRLA. So before we pass the floor to Ms. Brown, we would like to offer some insight into her professional background. For nearly 30 years, Ms. Brown has acquired, built, and led the world's most influential global luxury brands. Before joining LVMH, she served as a managing director at the Carlyle Group, helping build the firm's global consumer and retail practice. Additionally, she co-led deals while serving on the boards of Donna Karan, Marc Jacobs, and Fresh Cosmetics. While serving as director of LVMH North America, she also oversaw the development and global expansion of over 70 brands in their portfolio. So in the book that we will discuss today, Aesthetic Intelligence, Ms. Brown discusses her theory and the importance of incorporating aesthetic values into brands, businesses, and products. This conversation will run for approximately 45 minutes in a format of Q&A discussion. So since it is a conversation, feel free to raise your Zoom hand at any point to submit your questions verbally. So again, thank you, Ms. Brown, for being here today, and we really appreciate it and look forward to this insightful discussion.
Okay, well, I look forward to your questions, and thanks again for having me. I guess I'll start by saying, why did I write this book? Because I'm not a professional writer. I really was a corporate officer for much of my career. I'd say if there was any common thread across all these different chapters, it was that I've always had an affiliation and a real sort of passion for great, beautifully designed, exciting, distinct consumer brands. And whether I was investing in those brands or acquiring the brands on behalf of a corporate buyer or running the brands, or even looking at new brands being created, I could be excited from any of those entry points. But this idea of what makes a brand special and the emotional quotient was something that I felt not only was somewhat under or misunderstood, but also I looked at when I graduated from business school in 1995, I was a marketing major, and the world has changed dramatically in the 25 years since I graduated, but the way most business schools are still orienting their future marketers hasn't changed that much. And so part of the reason I wrote this book was that I felt that the world of brands and of marketing required a new vernacular. And then part of the reason I wrote the book is I felt that I had been in these worlds of sort of design-driven, creative, emotionally intense concepts that made all the sense in the world for businesses like luxury or fashion or jewelry or cosmetics. But all these other industries really never thought that that factored in: automotive, heavy industry, technology. And I felt that the times had changed and there was a lot of opportunity to apply those lessons into these other businesses, even financial services and insurance. There can be, and is starting to be, some aesthetic value embedded. And if nothing else, as a way to communicate, to tell story, and to connect with the customer on a deeper level. So I wrote it, number one, because nothing in the marketplace really seemed to reflect what I was seeing or feeling was needed. And I also wrote it because I thought, as I started teaching first at Harvard Business School and now at Columbia, that that there was a new generation that sort of deserved to think a little bit differently, and that we live in a world where, you know, when I graduated Wharton, or when my father graduated Wharton in 1954, if you just followed the basic laws of business, which is scaling a company, running it quicker or more efficiently, trying to produce things cheaper, you could continue to extract value. But nowadays, in the global world that we live in, and with the ever cheaper cost of automation, it's sort of a race to the bottom. It's very hard to win on those industrial principles. And the companies that are winning, obviously they have to do all that supply chain and operational work well, but they have to be built on a good idea, and they have to connect with customers in a much more profound way. And I mean that for every industry. So that was the genesis of the book. And now, just to give you a sneak peek, and then I really do want to open it to what questions you have or even comments and reactions. But the one thing that I felt I couldn't accomplish in the book, which pained me, but it was the reality of writing something that, was meant for one period of time and only had so many pages to offer, was the methodology, was how do you actually develop intelligence, not just what is aesthetic value and how do you, and why does it create a competitive advantage for companies, but how does the individual actually elevate their own taste level and how do they apply it? And so I'm now in the throes of developing an online learning platform for individuals to be able to work and do different exercises and sit through master classes and take diagnostics, so that you can start to personalize it and actually apply it for yourself. So if all goes well, that'll be out in early 2021. And so now back to the book. I would love to hear what caught your attention, what confused you, what you disagree with, what you are curious about. Ask anything.
Well, first of all, we want the information about the platform. I think it would be great for us to learn about it and to also share it with our network. So please send it when you have it ready. We'd be more than happy to start. Maybe the pilot program, we can even be part of that if that's possible. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I can start with some of the questions when I was reading the book. So this one is a bit more personal, but I developed a brand with my sister last year, and we've been trying to kind of define the aesthetic of the brand and whatnot, but sometimes we notice that our personal aesthetic translates through the brand. So whenever, for example, I want to wear something that doesn't necessarily align with the brand, but it kind of aligns with what I like, I was kind of wondering, what things could you recommend us to kind of keep a balance between personal aesthetic and brand aesthetic, like how to separate both?
Well, I would tell you not to separate both. I would tell you that the best brands really do start as very personal odysseys. And the challenge shouldn't be, how do I create demarcation between what I feel looks and works for me, but how do I even cull more of it? And how do I do it in very original ways? So I guess my question for you is there a reason you felt that your brand aesthetic should depart from what your personal aesthetic is?
I do not, but sometimes I fear that, for example, if from day to night I choose, okay, my style is no longer elegant, it's more rockstar, then I would start tainting the brand with my choices, no? So I was kind of fearing that, okay, I may deviate brands or customers, if I in a way represent the brand and I change my style, how would it affect the brand itself? That was
so two reactions to that. One is most great brands are not boxed into one very narrow style, and even the idea that you might have as part of this brand proposition two conflicting styles coming together can make it quite interesting if those are genuine and if it's done tastefully. That's point number one. Point number two is that I would not worry so much about capturing the daytime people, the nighttime people, the weekend people. I'd go really deep and narrow with one group. Where I find a lot of early stage brands get derailed is they try to be too appealing to too broad a consumer base, and in the end they just become diluted down to nothing, very generic. And so I always say, if you had a choice, if you have to do the trade-off between being a number one brand in your category for 5% of the population or being a top 15 brand for 95% of the population, go for the 5. Because to be the number one, you create that cult. And that's really where most great brands emanate from.
That is very right. Thank you, Pauline, for the insight. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Who else has a question or a comment?
I also have a
Sophia?
question. So I was just wondering what would be kind of like a simplified walkthrough of your process when you're approaching a company that you think should undergo a process you've discovered that works and improves company sales.
Mhm. Well, so there's a lot of different aspects to improving sales, right? So you're always starting there, and by no means does getting the aesthetic strategy right in any way mean you can get away with not doing everything else right too. Obviously, the functionality of what the company is doing, the business model has to be right. So there's a lot of different components. And so I always say it shouldn't be either or, you know, like linear, logical, analytic thinking or creative, inspired, aesthetic thinking. It really has to be the combination of both. It's very situational as to how I would approach it. There is a chapter in the book where I talk about 6 or so classic business problems or business challenges. It can be everything from I'm a newcomer in a category that's extremely crowded. That's one business problem. Another is I'm a strong player in a category, but I have a market leader that is a lot stronger than I am and I'll never catch up. Walmart versus Target. Another issue might be I was once a strong player and then I kind of got dusty and I didn't really innovate, or if you're a fashion company, didn't keep up with the times. How do I refresh? How do I become relevant again? That would be what Burberry was going through some years ago. So there's all these different clusters of problems, and how you approach the process itself will vary based on what problem you're trying to solve for. But I always say that in addition to solving the basic business problem that underlies, to really think about this, you know, who the market is today. It's super important that very few people are buying products out of fundamental need. A small portion of what we buy, I mean, we need food, but we probably don't need 80% of the specific food products we buy. We need to be clothed when we walk around, but we don't probably need 95% of the items that we buy to put on our body. So much of what we're spending on is highly discretionary. And studies have shown that the ones that can resonate emotionally with the buyer to a tune of about 85% of the decision-making is based on some emotional trigger. So again, I would sort of start with what is the emotion that you're trying to trigger? An emotion doesn't have to be happy. I mean, Disney makes people happy, but you know, another brand like Acne denim isn't about making people happy, it's about cool, right? And you know, MAC Cosmetics is a very edgy brand. And so there sort of starts with a core emotion or a small set of emotions that you're trying to achieve. And how can you work with different aesthetic cues or elements to really convey that? And that would be the process I would at least as a starting point.
I have a question. If you were to take your aesthetic intelligence lessons and apply them internally within your role at LVMH now, in this post-pandemic world, would they change in any way?
Well, LVMH, I mean, it's not a perfect company, but I would say when it comes to institutional aesthetic intelligence, it's pretty high up there. And so so now I recently joined, and I'll answer this in real time. I recently joined the board of Neiman Marcus, which has just come out of bankruptcy, and they're hoping, and it'll take a few years, to really create the luxury store of the future. Because we all know that the traditional department store model doesn't feel particularly luxurious or desirable anymore. And I look at within a Neiman Marcus store, the sections of the store that are actually buzzing. Usually it's around streetwear and sneakers. And the sections of the store that are like ghost towns, and it's usually like around women's work clothes, because who's buying that now? And I say the issue with them is not, even before they get to how are we going to redesign the stores and how are we going to retrain people to kind of really be much more relational than they've been historically, it sort of starts with just basic assortment. So if I were at LVMH now, I think especially within the fashion division, and fashion is one of the most distressed segments of luxury, I would give people as much insight, not into the consumer marketplace at large, but into where their consumer's head is at. Because I go back to, these are emotional purchases, and people are still buying clothes. The same woman who might have been buying, stilettos before might be buying yoga pants now. She's still spending. I don't see consumers saving a lot more. They're just spending quite differently. The same consumer who was going to Equinox before might be spending on their Peloton at home now. So I think that the best I could do in that role is to arm the brand heads with as much insight in the shift that she or he is making. There are certain trends that I think are going to be very long-standing. They will last well beyond this pandemic. And there are certain ones that we're seeing, very dramatic ones, that I think will normalize back to what we knew earlier. And so I think it's also very important when you go through these disruptive times, not to radically change everything, to be patient, to know that, to brace yourself, it's going to take a while, but to be very mindful that some of the things, human nature doesn't change on certain fronts. The need for people to decorate themselves. Right now, people are decorating their spaces instead of, their wardrobes. But the decorating, the impulse for decoration and for sort of creating environments that feel good, that's universal. And that's not people often think that that's reserved for people who are luxury shoppers. But at every price point, at every socioeconomic level, people want to feel good, they want to look good, they want to, be in nice spaces, they want to have good meals. They can't afford to do all the things that people with unlimited means can, but they still are trying to optimize with what they can.
I also had another question as well, just following up from what you said. I was wondering how companies should position themselves to be more strategic and competitive, especially regarding value creation, given the current climate with the pandemic.
Well, I think companies have to be careful not to become too, I think, pandering. Consumers are so smart, and they're, and I'll just go back a few years ago when, I don't know if you would remember, because you're all quite young still, but Pepsi came out with a campaign. They decided it was sort of cool to jump on this multicultural bandwagon and to use, hipster millennial, and to kind of, this was pre Black Lives Matter. It was maybe the first wave, but it was certainly pre George Floyd and all that. But the protests were starting to get traction. I think at that point they had the Million Man March. And so they had some very tone deaf ad. They used Kendall Jenner. They kind of were trying to showcase Pepsi as like this cool company that was part of the movement. And the whole thing fell incredibly flat, and they pulled it right away. And so I think because what we're going through right now, is hitting us so profoundly and so deeply. This is the only incident in my life or event in my 50 plus years that I would say has hit every corner of this earth. Like there's not this, 9/11 was traumatic. I was in New York, but if I was living in Sweden, it was a television story. SARS was traumatic if I was in Hong Kong, but I wasn't. So, right, so this is hitting everybody, and it's hitting at every level, from young kids who are now schooling differently to old people who are feeling their life is at risk, and so the sort of profundity of this, I think, requires a very delicate approach by companies. I think it's so one of the things, like I was watching these fashion weeks of, the last month, 6 weeks. And I don't think that they did it wrong, but there was something incredibly kind of off base about seeing women, who are still predominantly, thin white models between the ages of, 16 and 19, wearing very extravagant gowns, walking in these sort of surreal environments. And just the fact that they were digitized didn't make it, well adapted to where we're in. So I think the problem with big companies, small companies have the luxury, and I mean entrepreneurial companies, to pivot very quickly. But big companies, there's very few people in them who really feel full agency and who know how to operate when the old rules are taken away. And so, so I guess going back to the question, I think most companies have to be, if they're not sensitive enough in normal times, like they have to be twice as sensitive as they've been trying to be in these times. So that would be one thing. I think, and part of that sensitivity is also realizing that your main audience is not Wall Street. However much pressure you feel to grow, this is a time to really show the people who've kept you in business, which are the buyers, that you care, that you're in it for the long term, that you too have to pay some prices. And some businesses are just not going to make it, which is very sad, particularly for the employees. But that's just the reality. And some of the corrections we're seeing, by the way, are not because of the pandemic. The pandemic just accelerated them. There were too many brands competing in, too many stores with too few people who cared. And that natural progression just had to come to an end. Nobody expected it to come to an end in the way that it has.
Going off of what you said about kind of how big brands have a harder time pivoting, how do you see big brands as being able to strike the balance between curating kind of an aesthetic, a sense of aesthetics around themselves without coming off as inauthentic or as pandering to a specific audience?
Yeah, well, so the ones that I think work well, the aesthetic authority starts at the top. And I always say, I've been in many boardrooms with CEOs and CFOs and COOs, and let's just say you're on an investor call or you're, reporting to the board on a quarterly result. The CEO would never think about, when it came to a question about the balance sheet, saying, well, that's my CFO's demand, my CFO's domain, and he or she should answer, probably he. If a question came up about the supply chain or some sort of technological integration, again, you might have your team members go into the more granular components, but the CEO has a sense of ownership. But typically, when it comes to what I'll call aesthetic decisions, they are very quick to pass it off to the creative agency or to the art director. And I think it's high time that people, even in very big companies, take full ownership. Because if it doesn't start at the top, then you can only imagine as you get all the way down the line how disenfranchised other people feel. And the more now, it's one thing if it's a founder-driven company. So let's just stay with the fashion industry. Ralph Lauren, he no longer is the CEO. He hired a CEO, but his spirit is still very alive and well, and he's there, and he is the ultimate curator of where that brand is going and so forth. He has teams and teams of people who do the design, but his philosophy is still very much alive and well. There are a lot of other companies like a Christian Dior. Christian Dior has been dead for 50 years. Nobody even in this group would know what Christian looked like. But the people who are charged with leading the way, whether it's the CEO or the chief designer, they still have to know that business means nothing if there isn't an underlying idea and a philosophy that's kept alive. And the challenge with heritage brands, where your founder has passed sometimes 100 years ago, is how do you honor that heritage and the codes that are very hard to replicate? I mean, a new fashion brand can't just come on the scene and compete with something that has an archive that might be 50 years old. That's an incredible disadvantage. But at the same time, if you're just showing archival things, you feel like a museum. It's not how nobody dresses now as Dior had dressed them in the 70s or 60s, starting in the 50s. So keeping it modern and fresh, and at the same time still kind of true to the original principles, is a challenge. Now, take a brand like Vuitton, Louis Vuitton. So Louis Vuitton was founded in the mid-1800s by a carpenter who was Mr. Vuitton. he happened to live in Paris, and he applied his carpentry skills to building trunks. And this was the very first wave of the steamship engine. And therefore, for the first time in human history, people were traveling overseas, not just, you know, Christopher Columbus style adventures, but people really discovering and traveling for leisure. Now, keep in mind, most of those travelers were aristocrats, because you had to be wealthy to travel. But when they went overseas, they would go for 2-3 months at a stretch, because you'd be, you know, it'd take you weeks just to get wherever you're going. And of course, if you're going to travel somewhere for weeks at a stretch, and you're going to travel like royalty, you're going to be basically traveling with a few closets, which were trunks. And Louis Vuitton's innovation at the time was that most of the trunks were built out of wood, so they were heavy. They were on boats for weeks on end, and therefore they weren't. They couldn't safeguard from the water, so they got very moldy. And so he said, well, why can't we make it on this sort of very sealed, I mean, to this day, almost all of Vuitton's products are treated canvas, which is why they're so durable and light. Now, flash forward to 2020, there's nobody traveling, even if we were still traveling, with a trunk. Maybe you use it for a coffee table. But the concept behind it, which started with this sort of passion and adventure for and quest for global travel, that's still very much part of the spirit of Vuitton today. And most ads you see, most stores, even if it's very subtle, they always are nodding to this idea of visiting sort of these exotic parts of the world, but doing it in great style and doing it with them as your carrier. So that would be an example of taking an old world idea, making it relevant, but still at every turn reminding you that it's Vuitton. It's not just another treated canvas sack.
I have a more general question. Hearing about the launch of your master classes made me think and wonder whether there's a gap between having an aesthetic point of view and actually being an artist, meaning a gap between execution and intelligence.
Yes.
And if so, how does one bridge that gap?
It's a great question. And I'm glad you brought it up, because I've had countless people tell me in response to the book and the course that I taught that, well, I have no taste. And these are the same people. It's not that they don't care about taste. They might hire a designer to work on their home or a personal shopper to work on their wardrobe, but they just assume I don't have it. And I don't let them get away with that. And I say, first of all, everyone has taste. Some people are born with a lot more than others. Some people have to work harder to cultivate their taste. So when I talk about aesthetic intelligence, I am talking very much about taste. Now, taste isn't just visual design. In fact, the reason I use the word aesthetics as opposed to say beauty is aesthetics comes from this Greek word. I talk about this in the book, aesthetikos, which is around perception and perception of the senses. People with really fine taste are just generally very discriminating. You can have a fine taste for wine, you know, and you're just picking up aromas or qualities to the juice that other people aren't. A fine taste for fragrance, a fine taste, obviously, for design. For Donna Karan, who I work with at LVMH, I mean, her genius is not what you'd think in typical designers. A lot of designers are very good with patterns, like Alessandro Michele from Gucci is, he's quite sort of imaginative when it comes to patterns and textures and combining things that wouldn't historically or traditionally be combined in one outfit or one scene. That's not Donna's thing. In fact, she, for the most part, is just using monochromatic, you know, black, white, red. But she has an extraordinary finger for textiles, and she understands sort of the art and science of draping. And if you look at her archives, she came about in the 70s and 80s and through the 90s. It was very much about how things fell on the body, especially the women's body. And that is her genius, and that it's very much in her fingers. So the first thing I'll say is there are designers like Donna who actually know how to sew and how to drape. There are designers like Tom Ford Who doesn't? Ralph Lauren does not. They have a great eye, and they are able to mobilize lots of people toward their vision. So let me step away from the most obvious sector of fashion, and let's talk about Steve Jobs, who I think cracked the nut on technology. Before Steve Jobs, if you were in the computing industry, your goal was to put as much microprocessing power in as small a device for as little money as possible. And that's how you won, you know, whether you were Dell or you were Hewlett Packard or whoever. And he was the first one who said, I can't get away with having my devices be slower than the competition. They still have to be adequately, they have to function well, but I'm not going to win on functionality. I'm going to win on the emotional connection I make through all the design elements. And obviously the shape, the color textures, you know, silhouettes, how it was presented, how the store kind of highlighted, the lighting in the stores, all of that came together to tell a story that is why he could command such a premium. Now, Steve Jobs did not have a single artistic talent. He never went to art school. He made a big thing of the fact that he took calligraphy for a semester. But if you think about him as a character, sort of an archetype of an aesthetic genius, IQ, smart guy, but I would argue not on par with a Bill Gates, or certainly not with an Albert Einstein. Social intelligence, emotional intelligence, way below average, and he didn't even care to make it average. But his aesthetic intelligence was just so powerful. And it wasn't, as I say, because he had artistry, it was because he knew what looked and felt good to him and how to articulate it so that thousands of people working in his service could execute on it, whether they shared his taste or not. That is what I'm talking about. So then the question is, how do you actually develop it? And when I say everyone is born with some level, let's just start with the basics. You don't have to teach a child to enjoy ice cream, right? There are certain things, but you would have to teach a person how to enjoy wine. There are certain tastes that are cultivated. There are certain tastes and enjoyment factors that are just universal. We see that they see that in the human face. And I've done some work at the University of Pennsylvania. They have a Center for Neuroaesthetics where they study the brain and how the brain reacts to different cues of beauty. So there's certain things, there's nobody who walks by a jackhammer at a construction site and says, that's like music to my ear. It's cacophonous, it hurts your ear. But there are some people within the more cultivated music, some people love classic, some people love jazz, some people love punk rock. And you could argue, my position is one is not better than the other, although there are people who would make that case, I don't. But if you love folk music, you can continue to cultivate higher and higher of an ability to discriminate great folk music, great lyrics, great beats, from just more to the rudimentary. And that's the goal. And then the last question, which I guess is implicit in yours, so how do you actually do that? What do you do that? And I kind of very simplistically break it down into 4 steps, each of which take time and attention, but the first is just attunement. You have to be attuned to your surroundings and to your stimuli. We, as just to survive, we numb ourselves to an awful lot that we're confronted with day in and day out, noises and smells and stuff. We numb ourselves. Well, we have to unnumb ourselves, in order to recultivate some of the child in us. You know, when you're a child and you're wearing an uncomfortable, itchy sweater, you want none of it. And when you're an adult and it has a Balenciaga tag or an Off-White and it looks cool, you're willing to put up with it. You'll start to stop feeling the itch. So my point is we have to get back into our bodies. We have to feel what we really humanly feel. That's not good enough though, because you don't just want to be a bundle of nerves, right? And then the second step is what I call interpretation, which is as much as anything about being able to associate what emotions are triggered with what sensorial inputs are stimulated. So let's take the ice cream example. Even if most people like ice cream, there are people who love chocolate, there are people who love strawberry, there are people who like having more texture and so what they call mouthfeel in the industry, and there are people who like it to be more gelato-like and slippery. Whatever it is, there's no right or wrong. It's understanding why does one direction feel better to you, and what is that feeling you're getting. I've been noticing personally, I do some work now in the automotive industry, and on the aesthetics of next generation cars. And there are certain matte coatings, color coatings, that catch my attention. And I think, why does that catch my attention? And it's because it's not really matte. It's actually a little sparkly. It's kind of like metallic and matte at the same time. And it gives me an emotion. It's an exciting one because it's unexpected. So being able to interpret those input, those stimulus is very important. The third I call articulation. This is what Steve Jobs did so well. So if you're working in a company and you know and what feels and looks good, but you can't put the right words to it such that others can execute, you get nowhere with it. Then you may as well be a single practitioner, and and you can be very successful as a designer, but you can't be in business. You certainly can't scale in business. And then the last step is what I call curation. So the curation, think of a great chef. So a great chef doesn't just take his or her 10 favorite ingredients and put them in a pot, but decides which ones work together and which ones you have to edit out so that the holistic experience feels good. And that's to me, when you look at the most tasteful people in business or out, it's their ability to edit. And as Coco Chanel once said, elegance is refusal, like the ability to keep out things that are actually good, but are not enhancing.
I actually have a few questions. If, obviously you worked at LVMH for many years and you obviously must know the brands extremely well. If you had today to pick one brand that you think is the most successful at portraying its aesthetic intelligence, which one would you pick?
So I would, so look, it's a little like, picking your favorite child or something, you like different people for different reasons. I don't know that I would pick any of them in LVMH. And I've thought about that question. I mean, there's so many exciting brands out there. In the motor vehicle world, I adore Vespa. I mean, this idea that a simple little scooter can have a resale value that's almost as high as its original price when everything else is like the minute it drives off the lot is 50%. The whimsy of color choices like mint green and patterns, and this sort of Italian dolce vita lifestyle that comes through pieces of metal. Like, to me, that is a very exciting one. In the academic world, I used to teach at Harvard Business School, and I always said, Harvard is probably the most aesthetic brand that's ever come out of America, because you go anywhere and you see that crimson and you see the crest and you see certain iconic elements of the architecture of this old campus. And I mean, I just sort of say, how did they get away with this? But, and they're a heritage brand, right? But they stayed modern because the demand keeps going up. So in an academic world, I think that Georgetown has a very strong aesthetic to me, and Dartmouth, where I went undergrad, has a very strong aesthetic. But, the difference between, I think Georgetown's is very much marked by that central tower, that brick sort of almost iconic, religious iconic tower. The architecture of the Georgetown campus is probably its strongest code, which is what I call it. In the watch industry, I think there's no one that comes close to Rolex. I say, how can a little timepiece, in a time where we don't even need to use a watch to tell time, with just a crown in the center, have that much erratic power? And it's not, if you look at junkies in the watch world, collectors, for the most part, it's not that there aren't other watch brands that are as finely made, but I think that it's this combination of brand codes that come together beautifully and timelessly and go so deep. In the fashion world, I think it's a mess, to be honest. I think there are so many brands and they've been so loud and they've been working on this cycle for so long that it's as hard as it's going to be to see that industry contract, I think it'll come out of the other way feeling a lot healthier, that the brands that are there shouldn't be this many seasons a year, because at the end of the day, it just shows racks and racks of discount goods, and it's so dilutive to what they're trying to do on the other end. but that doesn't mean that there aren't individuals that I admire. I think that within the LVMH, one of the, among the best are the champagne brands. Veuve Clicquot, I love, and not because I don't love sparkling wine in general, but I love the story of Madame. So for those of you who don't speak French, Veuve is a widow, and I love her. She's an early feminist, you know, and I love that very iconic yellow. I mean, it's hard for a brand to own a color, and Veuve kind of owns that orangey yellow. You know, Chanel doesn't own black. So, I would say there's so many, and then there's so many bad brands out there too. I mean, sometimes I think that's as much. I sort of decided that when I come out with the this online platform, I kind of want to have like an aesthetic critique of the week, because there's just I've been spending a lot of time. I don't work for Tesla, but I spend a lot of time looking at it and trying to understand the cult following it's generated, which is a very particular type, and it's by and large men, by and large white men, and by and large, you know, coastal white men. And I think the aesthetics that they got right is the, what I'll call the interior feel. I actually think the exterior is very generic. I think their color choices are generic. I think their moniker is generic. I think the shape of the car isn't that interesting. But I think that the way it feels when you're inside and you press on the pedal, and, you know, and the fact that it has that extra spaciousness, that's the aesthetic that they got right, and that most people respond, especially these white men on the coast, very, very strongly to.
No, thank you. I mean, I love how you mentioned Vespa. Especially, it's funny because obviously, for example, a brand so like, for example, Dior, who just started a collaboration with Vespa, was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if someone else wants to ask a question, but I just want to ask a follow-up question. You
Sure.
mentioned how obviously the fashion world is going through this period where obviously there's so many seasons, and it was most like before COVID even happened, it was getting to a point where it was just like where designers couldn't even keep up with it anymore. So definitely, what do you think is the future of fashion in that sense?
Well, sustainability, I'd say is a necessity. It's not, you know, an ideal anymore. It's a necessity. I mean, the fashion industry has, for the last half century, been the second biggest contributor to environmental decay. The problem is so systemic. It's everything from the sourcing to the processing, even, you know, some of the labor issues, especially on the fast fashion side. So, and I think what happens, you know, when I was coming of age, like in the 70s and 80s, health food was for people who were very fringe. Like if you went to a health food store, you know, I mean, because there really was no chain like a Whole Foods as I was growing up. You cared about your health, but you were willing to trade off tastiness, right? Or sort of a sense of refinement. And then as we learned more and more about the real effects of industrial food and the atrocious effects of fast food, it conditioned us that things that we thought made food a little less appealing actually make it more appealing. So for example, you know, bread that is grainier means it's not less refined, it means it's actually better for you. Or food that is more simply prepared doesn't mean it's like farm food, it means that it's, you know, that it's more transparent and that, you know, you can actually taste the natural flavor. So we kind of condition ourselves, and these things take, you know, maybe a generation. And I feel like little by little, the fashion industry, by virtue of us becoming more and more aware, at least educated people becoming more and more aware of the effects, is training our eye to look at, for example, natural materials and with more of a positive, as opposed to polyesters, you know, which were the underpinning of fast fashion, and is what much of what we wore. But now I think we're becoming aware of, you know, what it's doing to our waters and how it disintegrates over time. It doesn't last, even how it gets absorbed into our bloodstream. So things that are handmade have a quality that we're becoming more sensitized to than we were as a population or society 20 years ago. I think there are people who are looking at furs or skins on bags with a little bit more sort of compassion. I mean, and I have more than my share, so I'm not being lectury here. I'm just saying I bought it, and I love my furs, and I love some of these, you know, natural skins. But wow, did a lot of animals suffer to make me feel, fashionable? And I don't know going forward that I could pick up new things with the same conscience or the same obliviousness that I might have had. So to answer your question, I think that the sort of fashion with a conscience will take over, and not because the industry is going to lead the way. There's always going to be players that are kind of on the fringes, but it's because the consumer is going to demand it. So that would be one. I think people will also, over time, you know, when we see this already with the rental market and the resale market, you know, the throwaway culture that many of us grew up in is a lot less exciting. It's a lot less exciting to buy something where you're kind of aware that you're going to get two uses out of it. Neither it's going to be out of style or it's going to look bad because it's not going to wear well. So I think spending a bit more, again, it's an issue of conscience, but it's also an issue of also making the right investment. I mean, you all could be educated much more cheaply than at Georgetown, but you made the investment in yourself because you felt that that was for the betterment of your future and the other, you know, in the world around you. So I think that's going to change the whole cycle. I also think it's so much easier for consumers to find their micro brand that appeals to them in the same way that, you know, if you think about the wave of social influencers, in the beginning, you had a few and they reached 1 million or more, or many more viewers or fans. And it was like network TV. And then we moved into this era where, you know, now there are thousands of influencers, and some of them might only have 30,000 followers, but in some ways have so much more connection with the follower than the Kardashian type, you know, gazillion million. So I think that the finding brands that really speak to you, it's more economic for the brands to get to you, and it's more exciting for the consumer. I don't think the consumer historically had the confidence to buy brands that they really had never heard of before. And I think that the confidence has shifted and the buying power has shifted. So those are just some of the changes that I see underway.
I actually had a question in that same line of influencers. So now, as you say, people don't associate a brand with their scent or with their visuals or with their aesthetic in general. They're also starting to associate it with the people that represent the brand. So these bloggers, these influencers. And I've been trying to debate with my sisters, should we send stuff to influencers or not? Because we're debating whether it adds value to the aesthetic of a brand, or rather it subtracts value from the aesthetic of the brand.
I think 9 out of 10 times it's good money after bad. 9 out of 10 times. I mean, I can tell you even with my own book, I'll give you 2 examples. I have one acquaintance. She's a fitness. She has 2.4 million followers. She's a fellow mom, 50 years old, has a PhD. So she's, you know, doesn't just live to work out, but when she turned around 40, she started entering some competitions, really getting into fitness. And then she parlayed that into an Instagram site. Just as a favor to me, one day, she, as the book was coming out, she offered to sort of give me a little promo. And I can see in this technological age when my Amazon numbers and other numbers move, I can see it instantaneously. And I can tell you for her 2.4 million followers and, you know, however many tens of thousands of likes, 0. It was probably a month later, there was a fashion influencer who, you know, is known for her taste. She's sort of lifestyle. And unbeknownst to me, you know, she posted something, you know, best book really transformed my way of thinking, something like that. And I saw within a 24-hour period, going in the rankings from at the time, maybe 18,000 on Amazon to maybe 3,000. I mean, it was a big swing and very quickly. And what I realized was, and she might have 1 million followers, so a good half of what the first woman. But I feel, first of all, that there was no connect between the first one, because nobody goes to her for book recommendations, and no one goes to her for business recommendations. They go to her just for her workout. And if she puts a diet supplement, they'll buy it. But it was disjointed. The second one, they go to her, and a lot of her fans realize she's running a business too, and she had a deal with Nordstrom at the time. And so I think that some of it was the credibility of the association. I think some of it was the fit, even the fit of her aesthetic and maybe mine and what I was trying to get across. My only point is I didn't pay for either of those, and thank God I didn't, because I think even the second one, if I had paid her, whatever the going rate is, I wouldn't have made money, even with that swing. So I would say doing it organic, really finding where is your tribe. There's a brand on whose board I sit, it's called Tomboy X. It was founded by this lesbian couple in Seattle. A couple years ago, they'd never been in the fashion industry. One of them was like in political campaign management. The other one was in the sports world. And they're like, there's no underwear brand for us. I mean, they're like bitch, by their own definition, they're butchy women. And they identify as women, but they were buying like men's Hanes because they want to wear briefs, and they're like tomboys. And all their friends in their extended network are sort of like-minded. And so they came up with an idea, they call it Tomboy X, you can Google it, of this underwear brand for women like them, who are funky and cool and very progressive. They live in Seattle, and they go to all the pride marches. And in the beginning, they just sold directly to their tribe, and they knew how to find them on Facebook and so forth. And now flash forward 4 years later, I'm an investor, and so they're doing about $20 million in sales, top line. They're never going to beat Victoria's Secret. There's not enough of them to do so. But they are the anti-Victoria's Secret, but there's going to be like 100 of them in their various little pockets that are nipping away at Victoria's Secret, and Victoria's Secret can never come back because they are so stuck in an archetype that is like 1990s bombshell, pre-Me Too. And it just is so, I think there's no way out. So my point is, with you, Anna, I would go really deep and narrow. Like, where's that cult that you can very cost effectively get to? And then kind of off of concentric circles, you can grow from there and grow organically and grow profitably.
Exactly. Thank you, Pauline. Okay, I think if anyone doesn't have other questions, I think we can start wrapping up to be mindful with everyone's time zones, etc. So first, thank you all for submitting your questions. I think it has been a very insightful and fulfilling discussion. And of course, we're very honored to have hosted Mrs. Brown today. If you're interested in learning more about the book club and the next series that we're gonna have, please reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to discuss with you. So I think with that, we're ready to set the evening. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for setting it up. And I wish you all well. I hope you can get back in the classroom sooner rather than later.